Before the invention of the flush toilet, the gleaming porcelain toilet, and the simple act of pushing a button to get rid of waste, there was only chaos. Constant, inescapable, stinking chaos. The Middle Ages were not just about castles, swords, and knights. It was, above all, about surviving the stench, literally. In medieval cities, smell was a living presence. Urine mixed with human and animal feces, strewn across the cobblestone streets. There was no sewage system. There were no septic tanks. There was only improvisation, desperation, and an unbelievable tolerance for the unbearable. People would dump their excrement into buckets, basins, or straight out the window, shouting the famous Gardy Loo to warn the unsuspecting that they were about to get shit-drenched, literally, and when it rained, hell ran downhill. Water mixed with garbage, butcher's blood, food scraps and waste formed a filthy river that snaked through the alleys of the villages. There was no privacy, no shame. Shitting was a public duty, a necessity that could be resolved wherever possible. Behind a tree, in an open field, or in the alleys between taverns. Imagine walking barefoot or wearing rustic rawhide shoes, stepping on all of this. This was the daily life of a medieval peasant. Sanitary chaos was so great that diseases did not spread, they dominated. Intestinal worms, dysentery, typhoid fever, and other illnesses multiplied at an absurd speed. Life was short, often miserable, and the bathroom, as we know it today, was a distant, unimaginable fiction. If you find it uncomfortable to use a portable toilet today, wait until you find out how a medieval peasant resolved his needs. The short answer, wherever possible. The long answer? It depends on your social luck. In rural areas, things were brutal and straightforward. Peasants would poop in the bushes, behind bushes, near the corrals, or in holes dug in the ground, which were sometimes covered, but more often just ignored. No toilet paper, bidets, or wet wipes. The most anyone could hope for was a large leaf, a handful of straw, or an old rag. That is, of course, if they wanted to allow themselves the luxury of cleaning anything. In the cities, the improvisation was even more grotesque. Residents used so-called chamber pots, ceramic or metal chamber pots that were placed under the bed or in corners of the house. At dawn, or even during the day, the contents were thrown out the window, often with a loud and sonorous warning, Gardy Loo, a corruption of the French Gardy Loo, or watch out for the water. If you weren't quick enough, well, a bath was inevitable. And in the castles, the elite weren't as above poop as you might think. They had what were called garderobes, small structures that projected out from the walls, where the throne was literally a hole in the ground that emptied the waste directly into the castle moat. The luckiest had stone benches with lids and a rudimentary ventilation system. But even that didn't stop the nauseating smell that infested the walls and the air. Some abbeys and monastic buildings developed more advanced systems, with running water channels to carry the waste away. But these were rare cases, gems amidst the general mud. Most of medieval Europe lived and died, immersed in a daily life where pooping was an act of courage and resignation. Imagine waking up at 3 a.m., going down slippery stairs with a torch in one hand and an empty bucket in the other. Your destination? The dark, fetid bottom of a communal latrine, a hole dug in the ground, often with years of accumulated human feces. Your job? Collecting all that by hand, filling buckets, carrying it on your back, and dumping it outside the city. Congratulations, you are a gong farmer. These men were in charge of cleaning up human waste from medieval cities and castles. Gong was an old word for manure, and farmer here did not mean a farmer, but rather someone who handled the material. It was a night job because the smell was so unbearable that the city lords forbade any operations during the day, so as not to disturb the residents or attract even worse pests. The gong farmers would climb down into the pits using ropes or makeshift ladders, breathing air so thick with ammonia and methane that many would pass out. Some would even die, from asphyxiation or drowning in piles of feces. But ironically, this was one of the best paid jobs at the time. The risk was high, but someone had to do the dirty work. Literally. However, the social stigma was brutal. These men were considered unclean. They had to live in isolation, were rarely able to marry, and many were the target of jokes, mockery, and even aggression. No one wanted to be around them, not even after they had taken a bath. Their clothes were often burned after the baths. Urns. And yet the smell seemed to stick to your skin for days. Now stop and think. Could you bear that? Trade the morning air for the fumes of waste, your dignity for coins, your solitude for survival? The gong farmers had no choice. They were the invisible backbone of a world without plumbing, where human waste piled up as a reminder that civilization was still primitive and fetid. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the smell of a medieval city. No, don't think of burning logs, freshly baked bread, or wild lavender. Think of something more aggressive, almost solid, as if the air had weight. A smell that was a mix of stagnant urine, human feces, horse dung, rotting food, and sweaty bodies that hadn't seen water in weeks. That was the real smell of the streets. A constant, suffocating stench that invaded your nostrils and impregnated your clothes, your hair, and your walls. The houses had no plumbing. Most peasants defecated in buckets, pots, or simply behind bushes. In the cities, latrines were rudimentary holes or suspended wooden structures that emptied waste directly into open channels in the middle of the street. When it rained, everything was washed away, or worse, clogged. When the sun was out, it dried up and rose in the form of dust. To make matters worse, animals roamed freely on the streets. Pigs, chickens, dogs, and horses. And guess what? They all left their mark, too. Sidewalks were non-existent, and citizens' boots always came home covered in questionable mud. A simple walk to the market could result in an accidental shower of excrement, especially if someone shouted, "Gardy Loo," a French expression that meant, "Watch out for the water," but in practice was a warning that a bucket of waste was about to be thrown out of the window. The architecture of the cities also reflected this chaos. The streets were narrow, poorly ventilated, and dark, and the buildings, built inward, created tunnels of humidity and mold. The air circulated poorly. Trash accumulated. The stench rose. People got used to it. But their bodies reacted. Watery eyes, nausea, constant respiratory infections. It was like living inside a compost barrel. This constant smell even influenced fashion. Heavy clothes, very strong perfumes, aromatic herbs around the neck or hanging from clothes, all to try to disguise what was already unbearable. But nothing really worked. The Middle Ages smelled bad, really bad, and feces, human or animal, were everywhere, shaping daily life, habits, and even diseases of the time. Have you ever stopped to think about what you would do if, when you finished, using the bathroom, there was no toilet paper, no shower head, or even a piece of cloth nearby? For most people in the Middle Ages, this was the reality every day. And believe me, the ritual of post-defecation cleansing was as improvised as it was uncomfortable. Without access to paper, which was very expensive and reserved for monks, scribes, and nobles, peasants used whatever was at hand. Handfuls of hay, dried leaves, moss collected from the bush, smooth stones, or even pieces of broken pottery. That's right, pottery shards. It was common for broken pots to be reused as hygiene instruments. The problem? The resulting cuts and infections were as frequent as they were inevitable. In the absence of any gentler material, people used their own left hand. For this reason, in many cultures of the time, and even today in some places, eating or greeting someone with the left hand was an offensive act. It was the dirty hand, used exclusively for cleaning the body. No soap, no alcohol, no notion of bacteria. The rich had a little more comfort. Some people had reusable cloths, which were washed, badly, and used again. Others used water and even vinegar to disinfect the area, especially in castles or monasteries with access to springs or wells. In more sophisticated places, one could find small bottles with essences or oils to disguise the smell. But for the vast majority of the population, the act of cleaning oneself was torture. Imagine the cold of winter, the discomfort of crouching behind a barn, the pain of an infected wound from a dry twig or a rough leaf. Small children often walked around with dirty buttocks for hours. Adults lived with infections, diaper rash, and constant pain. All of this in silence, as it was considered natural. The scariest thing is that this lack of personal hygiene was not seen as a problem. After all, Everyone lived like this. Body, odor, the smell of feces, accumulated dirt. It was all part of the environment. Only centuries later did humanity begin to understand the impact this had on public health, epidemics, and life expectancy. In the absence of frequent baths, toilet paper, or any kind of personal hygiene routine, medieval people had to find other ways to hide their pain and dirt that were part of everyday life. The solution? A true olfactory and visual theater, made of strong perfumes, strategic clothing, and a lot of dissimulation. Let's start with smell. Body odor was a constant, and not just from sweat. The stench of feces, urine, and even infections was as common as the sound of carriages. And to try to mask this, men and women of the upper classes began to use perfumed oils, aromatic herbs, and spiced wines applied directly to the skin or clothes. These essences did not clean absolutely anything, but they created a temporary cloud that hid the real smell. In France, for example, it was common to carry small bouquets of flowers, called pomanders, hanging around the neck or attached to the belts. The nobles smelled them constantly, as if they were using a shield against the rot around them. In monasteries and churches, incense and burning herbs created a sacred aroma that helped disguise the stench of bodies in prayer, or decomposing, in the case of the adjacent cemeteries. And what about clothes? Oh, clothes were a trap. Few washed their garments regularly, since the washing processes with ash and harsh soaps damaged the fabrics. So many wore layers of clothing not to keep warm, but to absorb sweat and prevent odors from spreading so quickly. Undershirts, called chemises, or linen tunics, acted as filters for filth. They were changed more frequently, while the more expensive outer garments remained dirty for weeks or months. At banquets and gatherings of the elite, the appearance of cleanliness was put on display. Dirty hands were covered with embroidered gloves. Oily hair was powdered with scent. Teeth, even rotten ones, were hidden by restrained smiles or veils. The elegant appearance hid a body that was deteriorating inside. This theater of cleanliness did not solve problems. It only covered them up. While the nobles used herbs to smell better, the peasants did not even know what soap was. The disparity was brutal. But even among the rich, knowledge about bacteria and contamination was zero. The idea that cleanliness is health would not be born for centuries. Among the many silent horrors of medieval life, few were as despised, and at the same time as essential, as the work of the gong farmers. This peculiar name designated a group of men in charge of an absolutely vital task: cleaning the human waste accumulated in the latrines, cesspits, and underground sewers of the cities. They were not just cleaners, they were the caretakers of society's intestines. The term gong came from the Old English gang, which literally meant to go. Yes, a direct reference to the act of defecation. The gong farmer, then, was the one who took care of what was left after going. Their routine was grotesque. While the city slept, these men worked in the shadows, digging pits with long shovels, scooping up mounds of human excrement with leather buckets, and carrying it outside the city walls in stinking carts. They were only allowed to work at night, not for any noble reason, but because the stench and the sight were so unbearable that their presence during the day caused riots, nausea, and even panic among the residents. They were often required by law to signal their presence with bells or torches so that others could avoid crossing paths with them. The risk was constant. Sinking into a contaminated pit, slipping on the waste, and dying of suffocation or infection was not an uncommon fate. Some of these pits were deep and treacherous, hiding centuries of human waste mixed with dead animals, blood, food scraps, and discarded objects. It was a thick stew of death. And ironically, despite the collective disgust, the work paid well. In some parts of England, gong farmers could earn more than many craftsmen. But this money came at a terrible cost: social exclusion. They were forbidden to live within the city limits, barred from churches, and shunned as if they carried disease, which, in a way, they did. Many died young, victims of infections, poisoning, or underground accidents. Some tried to mask the smell by soaking their bodies in vinegar or wearing clothes soaked in aromatic herbs, but it was no use. The odor permeated their skin, their hair, their soul. To be a gong farmer was to be an outcast, invisible by day, unbearable by night, and indispensable at all times. Still think your job is hard? If you imagine that medieval castles had secret rooms with stone toilets, decorated with tapestries, and scented with lavender, well, prepare for a shock. In fact, the so-called latrines were incredibly primitive constructions, holes dug into nothingness, perched on towers or leaning against the side of walls, with a single purpose: to let the excrement fall as far away from the nostrils of the royal family as possible. These structures were known as garderobes. They were small stone rooms with a hole in the floor, often positioned on ledges in the castle wall, from where the waste fell directly into the moats, hillsides, or rivers. Imagine sitting there, in the middle of a European winter, with freezing winds blowing through the opening, no door, no privacy, and the echo of the void below you. It was a ritual that involved more courage than comfort. And the most curious thing? The name garderobe was also used for clothes closets. This is because many believed that hanging clothes in this place would protect them from lice and moths due to the intense ammonia smell of feces. Yes, people literally left their cloaks near the latrine to disinfect them with urine. Welcome to the olfactory side of the Middle Ages. In the cities, the situation was not much better. Some of the wealthier homes had rudimentary toilets with stone pipes that led to small cesspools, but most people used holes in the yard, or worse yet, the good old chamber pot, which would be emptied out the window with a ritual cry of Gardy Loo, a corruption of Regarde l'eau, or watch out for the water, in French. The water, of course, being a euphemism for a bucket full of excrement about to fall from the second floor. In communal settings, such as monasteries or larger villages, there were structures called reredouters, rows of open-ended toilets where monks or peasants would sit side by side to relieve themselves. No privacy, no flushing, just the sound of entrails and the smell of communal life. And do you know what happened on feast days, or when the water supply froze? Nothing. Literally nothing. The cesspools filled, the chamber pots overflowed, and the ground became a minefield of human waste. Sewage was an absent concept. The city smelled of truth, and that truth was fetid. In the end, medieval hygiene was not just rudimentary. It was public, shared, and deeply uncomfortable. The modern idea of going to the bathroom in privacy with soft paper, soap, and a flush toilet would be considered an unspeakable luxury. Here, everything was raw, direct, and inescapable. Beneath the latrines, chamber pots, and urinated alleys lay an invisible, shadowy, and often lethal world: medieval septic tanks. To call them sewage systems would be too generous. They were, in fact, deep holes dug into the ground where waste accumulated day after day, year after year. A bubbling cauldron of feces, urine, food scraps, and whatever else happened to fall in by accident. And this accident sometimes included people. What few people realize is that the septic tanks were not emptied frequently. On the contrary, they were allowed to accumulate to the point of unbearability. When it was finally time to clean up that putrid swamp, the gong farmers, the sewage farmers, came on the scene. Men who were paid, very well paid by the way, to go down into the septic tank and remove all the contents of human decay with shovels, buckets, and their own body strength. The work was done at night, to avoid the intense stench that invaded the streets during the day. They worked in silence, covered in excrement up to their chests, breathing through rags soaked in vinegar to withstand the smell. These workers were viewed with contempt and fear. Many believed they were cursed. Some developed mysterious illnesses. Others died suffocated by the toxic gases, mainly the methane accumulated at the bottom of the septic tank. There are records of men who lit torches to see better and blew themselves up while working. They literally died by making other people's poop explode. And when the septic tank overflowed, the contents ran down the alleys, invaded houses, contaminated water wells, and caused outbreaks of disease. It is no coincidence that the bubonic plague spread easily in an environment where rats swam freely in this broth of death. But there were more horrors. In times of war, castle septic tanks could be invaded by disguised enemy soldiers who climbed through the sewer outlets. A risky but real strategy. And if you think this is an exaggeration, know that archaeologists have found entire bones, inside ancient septic tanks. Accidental deaths, punishments, clandestine burials, we will never know for sure. The septic tanks were not just deposits of excrement, they were fetid tombs of secrets, disease, and human suffering. A reminder that behind every stone wall there was a cellar where the rot of the real world could not be ignored. Imagine yourself in a medieval alley, crouched behind a stable, or on a wooden slit at the top of a communal latrine. You've just done what you had to do. And then the inevitable question arises, what to clean with? In the modern world, the answer is automatic. Soft toilet paper, scented sheets, maybe even a bidet. In the Middle Ages, this luxury didn't even exist as a concept. And the alternatives? Well, they ranged from the uncomfortable to the grotesque. Among the peasants, the most common answer was whatever was around. Twigs, pieces of wood, straw, dry leaves, moss, or even flat, smooth stones were used as disposable rags. In some colder regions, compacted snow was used. That's right, pure ice directly on the body. And if you think that's extreme, wait until you hear that some poor souls used pieces of broken pottery, a choice that literally hurt anyone in a hurry. In castles, the options were more refined, but still questionable. Old fabrics and washable rags could be used by the nobility. Some sources mention the use of goose feathers, especially wet ones, as a kind of royal handkerchief. But this was rare and restricted to those with money. There were also records of the use of seashells in coastal regions, and even the reuse of old parchment paper, already written on, for sanitary services. That's right, old documents with poems, contracts, or records became butt wipes. And hygiene? Very little. The concept of washing after defecating was almost non-existent. There were no antibacterial soaps or taps with running water. Most people cleaned themselves badly and returned to social life with the remains still on their bodies, which contributed to the general smell of towns and cities. It was a shared stench, a perfume from the Middle Ages. Interestingly, there was no taboo about talking about it. It was part of everyday life, just as we talk about traffic or the weather forecast today. Except that instead of, "Is it going to rain today?" someone might ask, "Are there any dry leaves behind the barn?" The lack of something as basic as toilet paper reminds us of a brutal truth. The Middle Ages were not romantic. They were dirty, uncomfortable, and raw. Every physiological need was a battle between the body and the available resources, and the winners were those who managed to get out of the bathroom, or the woods, with the least amount of scratches, infections, or embarrassment. It may sound crazy, but in the Middle Ages, urine wasn't just a byproduct of the body. It was a resource, a reused fluid, a multifunctional liquid that could be used for everything except immediate disposal. Yes, you read that right. Urine was collected, stored, and used in everyday activities like cleaning clothes, disinfecting wounds, and even treating medical conditions. And before you feel nauseous, understand, the medieval world was ruled by scarcity. And where there is scarcity, there is creativity, or desperation. In the field of cleaning, especially in cities, so-called fullers, cloth beaters, used aged urine to wash and bleach clothes. Why? Because urine contains natural ammonia, a powerful cleaning agent. The cloths were dipped in buckets of urine, trampled or rubbed with stones, and then left in the sun to dry and sterilize. Or at least that was the theory. The smell? Filthy. But in practice, it was effective against some stains and even fabric lice. The collection was organized. Houses would place buckets outside with lids. The English phrase piss pot was not an insult. It was literally what was used. And one of the most bizarre phrases in medieval English was Gardy Loo, a warning shouted from windows, before throwing the contents of the pots, including urine and feces, into the streets. Watch out for the piss, a survival rule for those who walked below windows in the damp, fetid alleys of cities. But the most disturbing part is yet to come. In medieval medicine, urine was considered a window to the soul and the body. Doctors would taste and smell patients' urine to diagnose illnesses. And in certain treatments, it was common to recommend bathing wounds in warm urine, one's own or someone else's, in the belief that it purified the blood and accelerated healing. And as if that weren't enough, there were those who believed that drinking small doses of urine at dawn could cure leprosy, melancholy, and even infertility. Urine therapy is not a new invention. It has its roots in the desperation and ignorance of centuries past. After all, what we consider disgusting today was useful back then. It was rudimentary science mixed with mystical beliefs, and when the world smelled bad, pee was less despicable than you might think. If you think you've seen bad jobs, get ready to meet a profession that defies all limits of tolerability: the gong farmer. Yes, that existed. It was the official title of one of the most repulsive jobs of the Middle Ages, perhaps of all human history. Gong farmers were responsible for emptying the latrines, holes, pits, and houses of necessities that would become overflowing with human feces. Over the weeks and months, they worked mostly at night, and not out of shame, but because the stench was so unbearable that it only became slightly tolerable with the cool of the early morning. Imagine diving up to your knees, sometimes up to your chest, in a thick mud of human feces, fermented urine, rotting rats, rotten food scraps, and worse. They used shovels and buckets, but many were forced to dig and carry with their own hands when the tools were no longer enough. There were no gloves, there were no masks, only courage or desperation. The most curious thing? They were well paid, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. No one else wanted the job. It was a vital function to keep the cities breathing, literally, because if there was no one willing to clean up the waste, the cities would die suffocating in their own feces. And this had already happened in some cases of epidemic outbreaks, but there was also a dark and cruel side. Gong farmers were considered social outcasts. People crossed the street to avoid crossing paths with them. They were forbidden from entering taverns and churches. Their children were often prevented from attending school. The smell permeated their skin, hair, and even their souls. They said that the stench rose through their pores and never left. Despite this, they knew the value of what they did. Some even left letters, diaries, and records that expressed a certain pride. "Without me, London sinks," wrote an anonymous gong farmer on a parchment recovered from an abbey. Today, we look back with disgust, but also with respect, because without these anonymous and courageous souls, the sanitary collapse of medieval cities would have happened much earlier. And so ends our delve into the darkest and most fetid side of the Middle Ages.